Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the first State Street Forum of January 2022, the first of 2022. The State Street Forum is a monthly conversation that is co-sponsored by the Westminster Presbyterian Church, where I'm the pastor here in Albany, New York, with the New York State Council of Churches. And our executive director is here, Reverend Peter Cook. Hi, Peter.
Hi, everyone.
And also co-sponsored by the Focus Churches of Albany. And our executive director, Fred Bohr, is here. Hi, Fred.
Hi, good afternoon, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone.
The Focus Churches of Albany is a collection of 6 congregations in and around downtown Albany. And Reverend Rebecca Richards is here, who's a pastor of another one of the Focus churches. So welcome to you, Rebecca. And other terrific people, thank you all for coming. And we're going to be recording today. We do share this recording as a resource for faith leaders and churches and congregations across the state of New York. Our goal with these forums is to go a little deeper than the headlines with some issues of concern to people across the state, and to try to make some connections between our faith and our public life, with the hope that by sort of practicing and learning about that conversation here in this forum, that we become braver and bolder in speaking out in the public sphere, but also more able to engage our congregations back home in these important conversations. And I know that the end of the eviction moratorium, which happened, the moratorium ended on January 15th, just a few days ago, that this has generated a lot of news and a number of headlines here in Albany and in the New York Times and across the state. There's been profiles of aggrieved landlords and of tenants who are facing eviction and of activists who are trying to find remedies to this situation. So I'm very excited that we've been able to invite Ellen Davidson here today from Legal Aid to help us sort of navigate this conversation a little bit, and maybe even demystify some portions of this difficult topic and really what could be potentially a real crisis for the state of New York. And I'd like to just turn it over to Peter, who's going to say a word of introduction to Ellen.
Thank you, Heather. New York State Council of Churches is pleased to work closely with Heather and with Fred and Focus Churches on this forum. We think we bring to this policy space reflections on, the policies that are being put in place, and to help people kind of comb through the rhetoric and the promises that are made, and have precise understandings about what's being proposed and what has already been implemented. So I can think of nobody better to do this kind of analysis than Ellen Davidson, who is the staff attorney in the Law Reform Unit of the Civil Practice Area of the Legal Aid Society. Ellen has represented Tenant since 2001. From 2001 to 2006, Ellen was a staff attorney in the Housing Law Unit of Legal Aid's Bronx Neighborhood Office, where she represented individual tenants in eviction cases in Bronx Housing Court, in administrative proceeding, and state Supreme Court. In the Law Reform Unit, Ellen has worked with administrative agencies to make policy changes and with the legislature to pass tenant protections. And additionally, she affirmatively brings affirmative litigation seeking systemic changes on behalf of tenants across New York City and in state and federal court. So Ellen is an expert in federally subsidized housing and the rent stabilization laws. She has a great background. I love listening to Ellen in public hearings, and I know that you're going to appreciate what she has to say today. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being given the opportunity to talk to you all. We at Legal Aid have worked very closely with Peter on some of our legislative goals, and also in trying to keep our eviction moratorium, and in some of the our work around helping our lowest income clients with safety net measures. And so I have to thank Peter for all of his help over the last 2 years. As you can imagine, this has been an incredibly challenging time for everyone in New York State. But for low-income renters, many of whom in New York City have seen their incomes just destroyed over the last 2 years, this has just been a disaster. The health crisis beget the financial crisis, and we're still dealing with the effects. I've said in some of the testimony that I've done, when you look at before the COVID crisis, in New York City at least, we were doing very well in terms of our unemployment rates. But since then, if we've seen the highest, I think if you look at the unemployment rates starting from 76, which is where the New York State Department of Labor starts measuring unemployment by a month-to-month basis, we've seen the highest rates in the entire history of that accounting during COVID. Before then, the highest rates were around 11% in 92 for a couple of months. And since COVID, New York City at least saw unemployment rates at one point of 20%. And we're still at about 9%. And it's been very clear because of COVID and how this terrible pandemic affects people, that people who are stably housed have the ability to keep themselves safer than others. And so, as you all know, New York State had an eviction moratorium that said that if a tenant could put in a hardship declaration, said, I'm either having a financial difficulty because of COVID, or that moving in voluntarily would put me or someone in my household at risk because of comorbidities, that hardship declaration would put a stop to someone's case. And that's the law that ended January 15th on Saturday. And so it is a terrible thing that our eviction moratorium has ended. But the thing that people should realize is that there are still protections in place for tenants. And I want to talk about that because our most important message to tenants at the moment is please do not self-evict. Oftentimes tenants get notices that terrify them. Being in housing court or eviction court is incredibly frightening. And tenants need to understand, so if you have parishioners, congregants who are in this situation, they should understand there are still protections that are available for tenants. The first one is our rent relief program. So the federal government allocated money to the states and localities for rent relief. New York State got approximately $2 billion. And the legislature created the rent relief program. And so the rules were put into place by the legislature. And one of those rules is that if you've applied for the rent relief program, a case can't move against you, an eviction case can't move against you until the state agency has either approved or disproved your application. So anyone who is sitting on the waiting list, waiting to see what happens with their application, they are protected by that placement on the waiting list. I'm sure you all have read about the fact, and if you go to the state agency's website, you will see that we have run out of money from the ERAP program. But we believe that there are additional sources of funding that will come into this program, and there are two places that they could come. The first is the federal government set up this program, and as part of the statute, set up a series of reallocation efforts to take money from places that don't use the money and give it to places that need it. New York State was shortchanged in its initial allocation because the allocation was done by population. We have a greater percentage of low-income renters in New York State than practically any other place in the country. And we're a high rent state. And that's not just New York State. If you look at throughout the state, if you look at low-income renters, about 50% of them pay unaffordable rents based on their income. So no matter where you are, we are seeing tenants struggling to pay rent. And so we did not get our fair allocation. And other states have been unable to use this money. The first set of reallocations that happened were very disappointing. We got 27 million when we asked for $1 billion, but there will be an additional reallocation that happens in the next month or so. And then in March or in April, there's a new set of money to look at to see how much money is still available after localities and grantees have used it. And that is, at the moment, when you look at how much money has been spent out of that 21 billion, it looks like there's about 15 billion left that has to be either spent in the next month and a half or is available for reallocation. So we still have hopes that we're going to get significant reallocations from the federal government. The governor has made mention in her budget address this past Tuesday, I think it was, that she has another $1 billion in COVID relief funds from the federal government that she wants to come up with a plan during this budget process. She mentioned that maybe it could go to landlord tenants. Unfortunately, she also said that it would be available or could be available to any other industry that had been damaged by COVID, which, as far as I can see, was about all of them. So that's ERAP. Additionally, during COVID, the legislature passed a bill called the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which says that if you're involved in a non-payment case, and if you can show the court, if you can demonstrate to the court that you lost income during COVID, while the landlord can get a monetary judgment, the landlord can't evict you for failing to pay the rent if you are successful with this defense. Now, monetary judgments are very serious. People's wages get garnished, people's bank accounts get attached. It has significant consequences in terms of people's credit going forward. But there are so many studies out there which show that keeping people housed has significant consequences to health, educational achievement, and low-income tenants' ability to keep jobs. So it seems like keeping someone housed at the moment needs to be the first priority as we work to paying off all the rent debt. And then, for tenants should, if they have, should try to seek legal counsel. There are a lot of groups out there across the state that are trying to represent as many tenants as possible. In New York, we have a universal access, so most tenants are getting access to attorneys, but tenants should try to get legal counsel or get advice from the groups that are around the state trying to help tenants. The other things that we are trying to get that, frankly, these are legislative, these are bills that we were pushing before COVID, but we think COVID makes them makes these bills even more timely, are two bills. One is called Good Cause Eviction. If you are, most tenants in New York State, and that's the number is about 1.6 tenant households in New York State, can be evicted at any point simply because either their lease term is up or they're month-to-month tenants and their landlord decides not to rent to them anymore. The landlord doesn't need a reason, doesn't need to say that this tenant has not paid in rent or hasn't followed the rules or has been a bad tenant in any way. They can just bring a case, we call them no cause or no defense holdovers. We call them no defense holdovers because there is no substantive defense to these cases. We find that our unregulated clients are afraid to ask their landlord for repairs because so many times when tenants complain about repairs, landlords respond by not renewing their leases. Our law, the bill that we are pushing, is one that is modeled on New Jersey's law. New Jersey has had this law since 1974. And as far as we can tell, life has gone on in New Jersey post 1974 and good cause eviction. And so we think that figuring out how we can keep people housed during this crisis makes sense. Additionally, we support this program called the Housing Access Voucher Program. It's modeled on the state Section 8 program. And it would provide either homeless families or people who are unstably housed with a subsidy. The tenant would pay 30% of their income toward their rent, and the government would pay the remaining amount. This would both help people who are homeless gain paths to permanent housing, as well as address the crisis of people who since COVID have just lost all of their income, and would give them an opportunity to remain housed while trying to regain that income. So those, for the Legal Aid Society, those are our top two priorities as we head into this legislative session. We just, we believe strongly that we need more money, both federal, local, and state, to provide for affordable housing. Too many housing programs give money to help with development, but don't have operating subsidy streams, which mean that they can't rent to people who are very low income or extremely low income because they can't afford to do that. We have also been pushing hard for the money in the federal Build It Back Better bill, which I just, what we hear out of Washington on this is like crushingly disappointing. It was particularly important for us for public housing. We have public housing which is falling down around its residents' ears because of decades of disinvestment. And the amount of money we need to keep roofs over people's heads is just incredibly significant, and the federal government really should be the one who pays for it. I'm not the person who can tell you whether we expect to see that money ever. But we believe strongly that there needs to be a commitment from all levels of government to make sure that low-income New Yorkers stay housed. And so that's what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of months, pushing hard for these measures. Have I gotten through everything that you were looking for me to talk about?
Peter, you want to unmute there?
Yes, Alan, that was great. Thank you so much. I'm sure that we'll have follow-up questions. I know I do. But why don't we turn it over now to Reverend Paul Sweet. And Heather, you want to say a word?
Well, Paul is active in the Poor People's Campaign, as well as being a pastor in Troy. And welcome, Paul. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to these conversations. I'm always humbled and abashed when I have time to speak in such a forum. As yet, still not quite full reverend in the complicated Methodist system, still just a licensed local pastor in my chaotic office at this chaotic time. I think that's the thing that I've been meditating on for the past 2 weeks as I've been thinking about the end of the eviction moratorium, how much of an uphill battle it is to secure sustainable housing in this state, and just all of the reading I've done about the rent relief that has been happening is that everything has just gotten a whole lot harder in a time that's already devastatingly hard. One of the realities of my context here in Troy is that I'm usually leaving my office between 8 and 8:30 at night, and that's usually the time that the people for the Code Blue shelter are walking into our church to set up their cots and establish a safe-ish space to spend the night where at least they won't freeze outside. Housing is one of the most salient aspects of our lives that too many people take for granted, and that our legislation doesn't effectively ensure access to safe housing that has such an impact on people's lives. Whether it's the appalling reality that I read Sunday afternoon in the paper that our publicly supported housing is the last on the list to receive help from the rent relief, or just what our communities are doing as people continue to be priced out of neighborhoods, as it's incentivized to receive more and more out of rent. It's appalling that we don't seem to be caring for each other's dignity enough to allow for each person to have a safe place to lay their heads at night. Over the conversation, I've heard the crushing realities and the crushing disappointments that keep coming. We're in a place where we are activists, where we are leaders in our communities, where people are generally looking towards us, whether it be for support, whether it be for counsel, whether it be an ear. And we're all remembering that this just made things harder for everybody. It's hard to take care of others while we're struggling with the realities of this continuing pandemic. It's hard to keep finding the grace to give to others, whether it's in a courtroom, whether it's in our churches, whether it's just talking with somebody on the street who's asking for a little bit of help. I pray that we continue to see each person as a beloved child of God. I pray that we have the ability within ourselves to look up and give a comforting word when it's needed. We're called to do so much, but it's also so frustrating when people don't see past the dollars to the human beings that policies affect, that these conversations are seeking to look after. As we try to remember what we're advocating for, as we try to remember how it is that we come to the groups that we go from here to report to or to advocate for. There's a whole lot that can be said about seeking grace, seeking peace, seeking worth, seeking value. And even though things are hard, I hope that we'll find the space and the care for ourselves so that we can continue to provide care and grace to others as we figure out a way forward, as we try to show as much value to as many people as possible, and as we try to save some lives, as people begin the frustrating process of courts, as people begin the frustrating process of having to advocate for themselves after policies like this tell them that they aren't worth protecting. So that's my response to what I've been hearing and what I've been feeling as we've engaged with this conversation.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the reminder that part of what we need to do at this time is also to care for ourselves as caregivers and advocates. That this is really a long slog. It's a hard fight, and it's far from over. So this is an endurance contest too here. Ellen, you have been in this fight for a long, long time. And so thank you for your endurance and for your faithfulness to the vision of housing for everyone, of housing not being a privilege, but being a right. I want to open it up to questions now. And if I may, I want to just start off myself by saying, Ellen, you made a comment that I just hadn't, you connected something for me that I haven't connected before. And you pointed out that one of the issues behind good cause eviction is that when you are a tenant at will, or when you don't have protections of right to remain and your landlord could cancel your lease at any point, what a disincentive it is then to you're disincentivized for reporting the need for repairs. And I think in light of just the absolutely devastating fire, and actually there was just recently one in our area up here in Schenectady, but several fires recently where tenants lost their lives and where children died due to, in many cases, situations in rental properties that were not up to code. We somehow read these stories and shrug and think, how did that happen? How did that come to be? Without thinking about the ways in which we have designed and actually are all approving of a system that makes sure that such that there's many apartments that are not where repairs are actually life-threatening. So thank you for helping me make the connection between several recent stories in the paper.
Yeah, I mean, when I was practicing in Bronx Housing Court, most of my clients were regulated, but occasionally I'd be representing someone who was not, who came to me with repair conditions. And you'd have to say to them, yes, I can bring a case for you, but there may be consequences, and you have to go into this understanding that this may mean that your landlord doesn't renew your lease. And that's a horrible conversation for an attorney to have with a client, because people should have the right to live in safe and decent housing.
Wow.
Yeah, and absolutely. And there's vulnerable people in all of these situations, including children who can't advocate for themselves in that situation. Hey, let me open it up to the room, and we certainly, there's a number of people with expertise in here in our Zoom room, and also several of you who are advocates in this area. So let's just open it up for comments or questions or points of clarification, et cetera. You can put your question in the chat if you like, or you could raise your virtual Zoom hand, or you could also just raise your actual hand if you would like me to call on you for a question or comment.
All right, I see Mark Greenberg has his hand up.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks, Ellen. Ellen is always, when we're in a meeting with Ellen, we know that we're going to get great information and really be educated. So I really am always happy to hear what you have to say. And I'm so glad, Peter, you and Heather putting this together, because it's a great opportunity to learn more. And so as Heather mentioned, I've been doing this work for almost 40 years in homelessness and housing. There's always more to learn, and people say, I think I know a lot. I say, but I don't, but I know people who know a lot. And Ellen is one of those people. So it's a great community that we work with. One thing I just wanted to put out there, just the perspective on housing and affordable housing is, as we know, when housing is for profit, then the owner will have to take some profit out of the property, which means that particularly for low-income housing, there may not be a lot of margin in there for profit, and often the landlord will take that money out of repairs and out of providing services. So I think as a community, we want to promote to the greatest degree possible what's called socially owned housing, not for profit housing, where the housing exists to provide housing for people, not for profit. Now, we can't, some tenant advocates will say there should be no landlords. I don't go that far, but I say what we should be working towards is as much housing as possible where the tenants are owners, or the owner is a not-for-profit organization such as a faith community. And as some of you may know, Peter and I are part of the partnership for faith-based affordable housing community development, and also with the collaborative interfaith affordable housing collaborative. And what we're actively doing, Peter more actively than I say, particularly around the state, is identify congregations with property would be willing to consider developing property affordable housing on their property, so that we could, as landlords, ensure that the rights and the safety of the tenants is our first priority. I just want to put that out there. There's always a conflict when you're talking about for-profit housing, and we do the best we can to ensure that the housing is safe. But as we've heard, there are often many challenges in that. So I just wanted to put that out there as a kind of framework.
Ellen, we talked a little bit the other day about how to relate good cause to landlords who are doing the right thing, while that might be to their benefit. So I was wondering if you could take Mark's observation and build a little more around that.
Yeah. One thing to start with, and this isn't about right or wrong, just to understand, the one type of rental housing that is exempt from good cause eviction are small buildings where the landlord lives there. So owner occupied with 3 or less units would not be part of this bill. And there are practical reasons for that, but I will say that for the landlords, right? Someone lives in their building, you might want to exempt them from certain parts of regulation. But in an analysis that was done by New York City, it found that in owner-occupied small buildings, tenants tended to stay longer and pay less rent, because landlords who lived in those buildings, once they got a good tenant, they were interested in keeping that person because they were part of their community. And so that's one thing to think about. The other thing is that in New York City, there's an organization called the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, which promotes home ownership. And one of the things, they did a study in 2019, and one of the things they found was that more and more investors were coming in and scooping up 2 and 3 family homes. And they were pricing out New Yorkers who might be looking to buy their first property as a 2 or 3 family home, and then rent out the other units. And so, ordinary New Yorkers who are looking to own their first property and start building generational wealth were not able to, because investors were coming in and buying such high prices. So there's some evidence that would suggest that having good cause might scare off the investor class and then allow this housing to go to people who actually live in communities. The other thing I would say is that there was a hearing that the Senate did on good cause evictions, and there were plenty of folks who were in favor of good cause evictions and plenty of folks who came out against. And the senators who were in favor of good cause evictions kept asking the landlords, can you tell me what this bill will do like will stop you from being able to do? Like, is there a type of eviction that you want to do that this bill will stop you from doing? Is there a type of activity, a bad activity from a tenant, that passing this bill will stop you from being able to evict the tenant? And they finally had to say, no, actually, there's nothing. I mean, this bill allows all the types of evictions for cause that anyone can think of. The objections were ideological. It's my property. I get to say who lives here and who doesn't. If you tell me as a landlord that there are rules about my property, that's just wrong. And then I guess lastly, I would say the thing that I thought was really interesting about the hearing was there was a legislator, an alderman from Ithaca, who supports good cause. And one of the reasons he supports good cause is he's a small landlord. He owns like a 2-family house in New Jersey. And so he actually has to operate under the good cause law in New Jersey. And from his perspective as a small landlord, it just worked. It made the relationship better with his tenants, and it worked for him. So I think I'm hoping that answers your question.
Yeah, very good. I want to look at the chat, and I see a couple of hands. Oh, I see. That you lifted up 2 bills and wanted the names and bill numbers. I see we have one for good cause.
Yeah, I'm just putting in the housing access voucher.
Oh, very good. Okay. Marco and then Michael. Marco?
Hi, thank you, everyone. And I believe my colleague Lauren is also on the call. Really, just thank you so much for Ellen for sharing like your deep knowledge of this crisis. The Center for Law and Justice, we provide intake services, but also our focus is on social justice, public safety, and whatnot. And housing is a human right. Not only that, but these folks, these community members of ours, thousands of them, rich, old, not rich, old, young, old, what have you, men, women, families that will have chosen to stay in public housing for some time, for years and years, face a crisis, a coming crisis, where they will lose their homes. And it's something, for me, I guess you can tell I'm a bit new to this or whatever, but like the fact that seems to be a solution to this that seems just so simple, so sensible, that Lauren and I have, and our colleagues in this citywide, region-wide coalition, that is, just what is the back rent? For example, for Albany city public housing, right? What is the back rent owed for households? It's, whatever it is, I think it's like a total, it's like
$2,073
per household, correct? Right? So that's the back rent. We talked to the head of Albany Public Housing. Will they accept a lump sum? Yes. Okay. So there are American Rescue Plan funds available, right? So this isn't even just a normal year, right? The plan would make sense even in a normal year, but the fact that Albany County, I believe, got over $50 million worth of American Rescue Plan funds to tackle these sort of COVID-related issues, just for that reason, right? So we propose take, a portion of that funding and make
$3 million.
Yep, a little over $3.1 million. Take that make a single lump sum payment directly to Albany Housing, and single-handedly, Albany County would save and prevent for over almost 1,500 households from eviction. The energy or whatever that you see is the fact that we know what's about to happen. We all do in this room, in this virtual room, know that these families that are going to be evicted are going to then trickle down through the services or not. They're going to fall through the gaps, and then they're going to come, and it's a disaster. We see it. And why can't the county see it? Why can't the policymakers in the city see it, right? It's not time for performative reactions of, oh yeah, we received email after email, like, oh yeah, that's really bad. Oh, I support you. Okay, then show it, right? We have a very simple, again, policy recommendation. We've been talking with folks. So what is the holdup, right? So anyway, sorry, like I just like, it's a bit frustrating. So
Thank you, Marco. Maybe we just give Ellen a chance to respond.
Yeah.
I mean,
Ellen,
I think that's a brilliant idea. I mean, because the ERAP system was set up and put subsidized housing tenants at the bottom, even though subsidized housing tenants are some of the poorest New Yorkers. So you put the poorest New Yorkers at the back of the line, and now, who knows if they're ever going to get paid. So why not take American a rescue plan or any of the COVID relief plans and use the money? And I think that there's, among people in government, there's a sense that poor renters are sort of, it's their own faults that they end up in the situations they're in. And they need to dig themselves out when that's, it's true that people who live in public housing pay 30% of their income toward rent. But when your income is extremely low, that 70% is not enough to pay for necessities. And so the fact that, I think it's brilliant, and I wish Albany legislature would, or government officials would listen to you.
I also, I don't want to
Yeah.
like detract from the focus of like Albany, because we are like, especially like the Center for Law and Justice, focused on the plight of tenants in Albany public housing. But I have to say that, talking with folks on the ground in Schenectady and whatnot, really any place that's receiving American Rescue Plan funds, which is cities throughout New York State, and that also participated in ERAP and has public housing, would also be able to implement such policy and to make these hard asks. So Schenectady can do it, can make those asks, can make those directed asks and whatnot. All over the state should be able to, but it should definitely happen in Albany City. And again, I dropped a petition that we're looking to, our coalition is looking to do a joint letter, a press statement, whatnot. Please do sign on, and please reach out. I'll share my email and whatnot, and connect with us if there's anything, to see how we can assist each other with this fight. Thank you.
very
That's
good.
awesome. Thank you for that, the link there, Marco, because that's a great action step for us to follow up with. I think Michael McGlynn was going to speak, and then I see Earl Arnold has his hand raised.
Good afternoon. My question is pertaining to a place that has an occupancy availability. Will New York State government require the municipal building code inspectors to have the units cleaned, such as the walls washed and the bathrooms cleaned and everything, before they are able to get a certificate of occupancy? And will the building inspectors be required to know and to have proof that the HVAC systems are also cleaned, so that a new person or new family going into a unit has a clean place and will not be walking into a hazardous unit that hasn't been cleaned of any possibility of COVID.
Yeah,
And
okay.
you understand where I'm coming from?
I do. I think what's challenging when you get to housing codes and building codes is they tend to be local issues. Having worked with Housing Justice for All and now working with a lot of groups outside of New York City, it's been upsetting to see how many places outside of New York City. I know Albany has a good code enforcement operation, but many cities, states, towns have no one. I mean, they're not even doing the most basic checking of, whether housing is safe. Buffalo, for example, it's not unusual to have buildings that have no insulation in them, and the tenant is responsible for the heat. So I think we need to, as a state, and that's not to mention the terrible problems with lead poisoning all over the state, which has so many consequences for young children throughout their lives. So all this is to say, I support any efforts to get localities to do better about code enforcement. And I think, what you're suggesting makes total sense as apartments turn over. But the other thing we need to think about, I think, as a state, is that some of the reasons that a lot of these programs throughout the state are very poorly funded, and some of these are in communities and towns and cities that are very poor, and so it may take state money to get reforms of the local building and housing codes to make sure that people who are coming into housing are coming into safe places.
Yeah, but the Department of State has uniform building codes, and they have it for the entire state. And if CDC and the State Department of Health could coordinate with the county ones, just on the basis that this is an emergency and a hazard to the health of people, that they enforce it and use the money from the federal government to ensure that people who are going into a new unit know that it's not going to be COVID contaminated.
Yeah. So
I mean,
what's
that's
the
a health-
interplay, Ellen, between the state rule that Michael just talked about in these local housing laws? Are they?
Yeah, I mean,
obligated to follow them?
there is a code for buildings done through the Department of State. It's not that rigorous. Certainly it needs to be better, but I mean, I agree that worrying about COVID is important, but I would argue that lead poisoning may be and the rates of asthma that we see in low-income communities is as big and as imminent a threat to the safety and needs to be dealt with as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Earl, I'm going to move to you next.
Thank you. We're talking about a crisis of evictions, which will be going through housing courts across the state. If we want to do observe housing court and perhaps have a chance to talk to get some of the stories from the tenants and maybe even the landlords afterwards, how do we find out where and when the housing court is going to meet?
You know, it's a locality by locality thing. If you're in the Albany area, the United Tenants of Albany does a lot of work with eviction cases there, but I might look, if you're in a different place, I might ask a tenant group if who would have some understanding because it affects their members.
Okay. Great. Kimberly, you're next.
Hi, sorry. I'm Kimberly Marquise. I'm a member of the Messiah Lutheran Church in Rotterdam and also a member of the Schenectady Landlords Influencing Change. So I'm kind of walking a fence on both sides of this issue. Our church recently merged with another church, and so we are in the beginning stages of opening a community center in the location of the church we merged with. We have 4 tenants of social justice for that particular community center, and one of those is affordable housing. I'm the chairperson of that. So I'm really passionate about the fact that, you know, it brings me to tears that little kids live in houses that burn down and they die in. And I live in Schenectady. I actually live right around the corner from the house that this little 4-year-old recently died in. But I'm also a landlord in Schenectady. The gentleman that was just asking the questions about, you know, making sure that these buildings get inspected. I know in Schenectady what you must do, although I know that there are slumlords who do not do this. But those of us that are in the Schenectady Landlords Influencing Change group do this. You must have your apartment inspected every time it turns over. You must get a certificate of occupancy. A code official must come to your building and inspect it from top to bottom before you can re-rent it. I think, and many of us in the Schenectady Landlords, we go by the acronym SLIC. Many of us in SLIC feel that an annual inspection should be done. The problem is manpower. You know, just getting a code official to come out and inspect your building when the apartment is turning over is pretty difficult and put you kind of behind the 8 ball when you're trying to get it rented. Most of the landlords in SLIC are, you know, we're small business landlords. We're the ones that are providing affordable housing in the city of Schenectady. We are not the ones that own these big corporations downtown who are getting all kinds of tax breaks to build these big fancy apartments that the real people that live in Schenectady cannot afford. I'm going to try really hard not to get on my soapbox here because I'm very frustrated with all of this. It's so difficult for families in Schenectady. They're living in these horrible conditions because many of the property owners don't even live in Schenectady. They are, you know, from, you know, not even necessarily New York State. They're not there. They're absentee landlords. You know, they're not taking care of their buildings. Some of them aren't paying their property taxes. You know, so we end up with all these dilapidated buildings that end up having to be torn down by the city, blah, blah, blah. This is such a nest of a mess, housing in general in New York State. I don't know about other states. And specifically, I'm thinking about Schenectady. You know, the flip side of this is how do we support the families that need affordable housing and yet not dump that on the backs of the small business landlords who have been without their rents in most cases for almost 2 years now. I've seen too many landlords in Schenectady that have gone down. They've used every dime that they have of their own money to try to pay the mortgage, pay the taxes, keep the apartments up to code, you know, do the maintenance that needs to be done. And they've gotten no money. Now, some of them are starting to get the ERAP and the LRAP. That's finally starting to come through. But, you know, that was like a year and a half after the fact. And many of these small business landlords are now out of business as a result of not getting the rents. Many of the people that are in SLIC are people who this is their livelihood. You know, and they're not rich. They're not wealthy people. You know, they're average middle income people who work to take care of their properties. They're not big corporations. So it's just such a difficult situation. There doesn't seem to be any answer either way. You know, SLIC has gone to the city and said, well, you know, one thing we asked was when it came to the property tax, because of the eviction moratorium, landlords weren't getting their rents. They didn't have the money to pay the property and school taxes. Could they hold off on that, you know, and kind of give us a break? And they wouldn't, you know, I mean.
So Kimberly, very excellent question. I'm really curious to hear Ellen's response to this. And I think you kind of got the gist of this dilemma here, Ellen.
I mean, I understand, but I guess part of my question to landlords who are like, if the eviction moratorium had let me evict my tenants, I would have been able to get other tenants into the building who would have been able to pay rent. The truth of the matter is we were in the middle of a financial crisis. It's not like there are, huge numbers of tenants who would have, if you and your members had been able to evict all the non-paying tenants, I mean, one, what would it have done to your community to have that huge number of people who are homeless? And two, would you even have been able to find replacements for those tenants? Because when you're in the middle of a historic crisis, people lose jobs and are unable to earn money. So I appreciate that. From the beginning, from the moment in March 2020, when the crisis began, we started talking to our elected officials about needing to come up with a rent relief plan. And they did not. It took the federal government until December 2020 to have any money. And then, New York State didn't open their program until June, both of which was a failure for both tenants and landlords. So I agree with that. But I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure that evicting tenants would have solved the problems that small landlords had, because I don't know that there were replacement tenants who could pay rent available to be put in their place.
Well, I think we can see just how complex this issue is, and it's just have 3 minutes left of our time together. We do try to strictly abide by our 1 hour time frame, and we try to always end with some action steps. And I want to give a shout out again to Marco for a really good one for folks who are part of the struggle here in Albany. But Ellen, let me turn it over to you to give us some real specific things we could take action on this week in direct response to the coming eviction crisis.
I mean, I think supporting the housing access voucher program, which would help both landlords and tenants, might make sense for this group. So calling your elected officials and telling them that we're in budget season. So if we're gonna get this bill passed, we have until March this year to do it. So I have the bill numbers are in the chat. And so reaching out to elected officials and letting them know that this is a program that would help New Yorkers, I think would be very helpful. And then just making sure that as you come across tenants who are worried about the eviction moratorium, making sure that they understand they do have rights and they shouldn't self-evict. They should reach out to the groups in their communities who are there to help them stay in their homes, and hopefully they'll be able to.
Terrific. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Those are all excellent points. I will push everyone to, or invite everyone to, our Ecumenical and Interfaith Advocacy Day on February 16th, where we will lay out our housing platform of legislative asks of the legislature, and the housing access voucher program and good cause eviction for sure are going to be two of those asks, but also expanding funding for affordable housing. It's just not enough in what the governor has proposed. And again, Marco, thanks so much for us thinking about how to use relief money to cover the gap for public housing residents. And this is not just a issue, obviously in Albany, but in other localities across the state.
I really want to thank everybody for coming today. Thank you, Paul, for your thoughtful reflections, and thank you, Ellen, for being such a great resource to us. I just the point behind all of this conversation on State Street Forum has been to encourage the faith communities to actually have this conversation in the church, in the synagogue, among the small groups of the community, et cetera, to not have this just be advocates to legislators and elected officials, but to have it be a conversation that landlords and tenants and homeowners and people who are just part of the community all have together, to develop a sense that we are in this together, that housing is not just a problem for the people who can't afford it, that housing is a community issue, that evictions have a community impact and not just an impact on individuals. Let's keep the conversation going. And I hope tune in next month to another State Street Forum.
Great. We'll shut the recording off, but if people want to hang for a minute or no, so to get stuff out of the chat, we'll feel free to do that. Okay.